Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Randall Martin, and I'm the Executive Director of the British Columbia Council for International Education, and I will be the moderator for the panel today, where we will be discussing transnational education, the challenges, benefits, and missed opportunities. Before we begin, however, I would like to acknowledge that we live and work on the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. It is important that we take this time not only to acknowledge the history of those that came before us, but to also use these learnings to inform our policies, programs, and practices now and in the future, ensuring that they serve everyone in a more meaningful and effective way. I would also like to extend my respect to the lands that everyone participating in this session resides upon, and to welcome you to place your own acknowledgements in the chat box. A quick note that this session is being recorded, and to please put your questions and answers in the box so that we can answer your questions a little bit later during the Q&A period. Our speakers today come from the evening in Dublin, lunchtime in Ontario, and breakfast coffee here in British Columbia. Our first speaker, Dr. John McNamara, the Global Head of Research International Education Services, the British Council. Based in the British Council's Dublin office, John manages the delivery and presentation of international education research aimed at providing the UK education sector with the insights and market intelligence to succeed globally. John's going to give us a big picture looking at global trends. Dr. Diane Simpson, the principal of Humber International Graduate School at Humber College. Diane holds a doctorate from the University of Toronto in higher education and comparative international and development education. She worked with Dr. Jane Knight on that. Diane's research focuses on the internationalization of higher education, international program provider and student mobility, international joint initiatives, and technical vocational education in Canada and globally. In her current role, she serves as principal for the Humber International Graduate School in downtown Toronto, where she leads graduate programs for international learners with a focus on supporting learners in their transition to life and careers in Canada. And our final speaker will be Dr. Kevin Hall, the 8th President and Vice Chancellor at the University of Victoria. Kevin has served at many levels and functions at a university, from faculty member, research center director, and department chair to vice president and senior deputy vice president, vice chancellor of global engagement and partnerships at the University of Newcastle in New South Wales. Now, how this session came about, I think maybe less than a year ago, I was having lunch in Victoria with President Hall, and who just recently arrived in British Columbia, and we started talking about some of the things, his experiences in Australia, and some of the things he'd like to achieve at the University of Victoria. And one of those was transnational education. Similarly, I was having a conversation with Dr. Jane Knight, thinking, well, you know, really Canada and certainly British Columbia are not really pulling our weight, or punching above our weight on transnational education. And Jane introduced me both to Diane and to John, with whom she's worked in terms of people who are really expert in the field and could offer a lot to sort of articulating what some of the challenges and opportunities are here, and maybe helping set a pathway forward for further engagement, or at least further conversation here in Canada. So transnational education has been succinctly described as higher education study programs or sets of courses of study or educational services, including those of distance education, in which the learners are located in a country different from the one where the awarding institution is based. Now, there's a lot of definitions you'll be hearing today and a lot of language. The international education sector supports the mobility of students as well as staff and faculty, and TNE essentially refers to the mobility of programs. It encompasses diverse modes of delivery, such as branch and offshore or franchise campuses, articulation agreements, and both joint and dual degrees, distance education, COIL and MOOCs. It is in wide and popular global use, notably from the UK, from Australia, and from Germany, but again, from Canada, not so much. The pandemic may have opened the door for enhanced Canadian engagement in this field. So our three experts will explore the diverse global landscape of TNE, offer some definitions and language, articulate benefits and costs, and explore the rationale, opportunities, and challenges for enhanced and constructive Canadian engagement. We'll speak for about 30 minutes, after which please do put your questions into the Q&A box, and we look forward to a full discussion and question period at the end of that. So with that, I will turn off my screen and I will step back and enjoy John's presentation. John, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Randall, for that introduction, and good morning, good afternoon to everybody there in Canada. Big hello from the British Council. I'm dialing in here from Dublin, and it's a great pleasure and honor to be asked to speak at this event today. I've prepared some slides, so I'm just going to try and load them up first, and hopefully this works okay. I think we should be. You should be seeing my first slide up there now. So yeah, I'm head of research on the Education Insights and Engagement team at the British Council, and a big part of the work we do is researching and analysing and presenting on transnational education trends and opportunities, and we spend a lot of time trying to understand regulatory developments and essentially to try and help UK universities to navigate the ever-changing transnational education environment out there. So I'm very happy to take you through some of the kind of, I suppose, insights that I can provide, some of the global trends, talk about some of the different models of TNE, and maybe, you know, think about how this might progress over the coming years, and maybe understand a bit about where Canada fits into this whole schematic. I think, you know, just very briefly, I think it's always worth just to briefly, you know, pause and talk about what exactly transnational education is. I think Randall actually gave a pretty good explanation of it there. To my mind, I generally frame it as being, you know, a subset of the broader phenomenon of cross-border higher education, and I think these three bubbles that I've put up here kind of are a good way of explaining what it's about. The first one on the left is, you know, international student mobility, and I think we're pretty familiar about with that. The one at the bottom is faculty and researcher mobility, so it's another aspect of people crossing borders to engage in higher education. And TNE is really just that third bubble. It's, instead of people crossing borders, it's the programs and the providers themselves crossing borders. So the universities and the courses, the programs they deliver, crossing borders to reach the students, as opposed to it being the other way around. Now, in reality, and especially, you know, increasingly over time, these three aspects of internationalization, you know, overlap, and many TNE initiatives involve elements of student mobility, and involve aspects of faculty and researcher mobility. So really, like, you know, they're kind of like three legs of a stool in a sense. There's many different, you know, models and forms that TNE can take. I won't be able to go through this in any kind of detail today. I just don't have time, but I would like to point people to a report that myself and my friend, Dr. Jane Knight from the University of Toronto, produced on behalf of the British Council and DAD in Germany a few years back, which, you know, takes you through all the kind of nuances and the ins and outs of the different types of models out there and how to think about classifying and understanding them. Essentially, we came down on thinking about TNE as being either an academically collaborative endeavor or being independently delivered, and we under the independent types of TNE, you've got things like international branch campuses, and franchising and validation programs, and distance learning that's entirely self-study, so the students are either fully online or they've got all the materials sent to them in the post. But the bigger aspect, and where TNE is really kind of heading, as far as I can see, is more in the collaborative forms of TNE. So the likes of in the institutional space, the kind of joint universities and joint colleges out there that are very much a feature of the German model of TNE, and the way China organizes its TNE as well. It's where an institution is jointly set up by the two partner countries, and does it involve a lot of genuine academic collaboration between the two. two countries. And of course, then at the degree, at the individual program level, you've got joint and double degree programs. Not that all double degree programs are genuinely collaborative in nature, but at least in theory, that's what they're supposed to be. And then there's distance education programs that do involve some kind of academic collaboration with a local partner. And really, without going into too much more detail than that's kind of how we broke it down. And there's a number of kind of criteria that you could consider in trying to determine what type of a program the T&E program actually is, in terms of who has responsibility for developing the curriculum, quality assurance, who awards the qualification, and so on. I've listed them there. So that's a kind of a broad overview of the different types of models of T&E that are out there. They're much more complicated, and they overlap to a greater extent than I've probably indicated there, but that's a kind of high level view of it. I think for today's discussion, it's useful to briefly think about the reasons that countries and institutions engage in T&E. And I think there's a quite different rationales here, depending on whether you're thinking about this from a sending country perspective. So that would be the likes of, the UKs and the Australias and the US and Canadas out there, as opposed to from the host country perspective. The big hosts would be China, Malaysia, and Singapore, and increasingly countries in the Middle East and South Asia as well. So from a sending country perspective, one of the big rationales is it's an international relations angle. So the objective to build trust and kind of friendly understanding between prospective kind of partner nations. And I guess sometimes this is called soft power, certainly about achieving your economic objectives and socio-political objectives by building trust, as I say. It's a big driver of it for some countries. I think it's also seen as a mechanism to broaden your reach, to recruit, from a broader prospective pool of international students. Not everybody can afford to come and study in Canada, for the full degree program. So T&E offers that kind of option to reach students that maybe can study all of the program in their home country, or study part of it in their home country and part of it in the sending country. So that's an important driver, and also it enables countries to recruit from a broader mix of jurisdictions. So that diversification is a big driver as well. Some countries as well, and I think Germany would be a good example, use T&E as a means to develop the skills and the kind of experience that their industrial base needs. So a lot of the graduates of German T&E programs end up working in German industry in the region, and that's why a lot of German T&E has places a big emphasis on internships and traineeships and so on. So that's kind of some of the drivers from the sending country perspective. For the host countries, it's a bit different. They look upon T&E as an opportunity to provide increased access to their domestic higher education, to their domestic student population. They also look at it as an opportunity for their institutions to learn from the foreign partners. So there's a kind of a lot of knowledge transfer that takes place. It's taken place to a huge extent in China, for example. And that's kind of seen as a way to maybe improve the quality of the offer locally. And also some countries, of course, have an ambition to be regional education hubs in their own right, and T&E has been used very successfully by some countries in that regard. From the institution's perspective, and I guess this is directly relevant to you guys on the call today, on the webinar, from the sending country, certainly it's seen as a mechanism to recruit students. So an awful lot, a big proportion of the international students in the UK, for example, are recruited through T&E pathways. That has definitely been an attractive reason for getting involved in T&E. It's also presents opportunities for universities to send their own students and their staff abroad on exchanges. In some cases, T&E can result in accessing of research funding. I mean, I wouldn't want to overstate this, but it certainly it can happen and does happen. Again, China is probably a good example. Some countries in the Middle East as well. And to a large extent, universities use T&E to position themselves globally, to have that kind of global footprint, to build their brand, to raise awareness about their institution. Definitely a big driver. And then from the host country perspective, it's more about internationalizing their curriculum, It's about raising their own prestige and sometimes improving themselves in the local rankings. And sometimes it's practical considerations, like many higher education institutions in some of the host countries, wouldn't have degree awarding powers. So partnering with a foreign university enables them to deliver degree level qualifications, albeit foreign ones. So that's some of the kind of rationales that you would be kind of considering and thinking about from both a national and institutional perspective. In terms of the global trends, I think it's difficult to track and to be exact about it. There's not that many countries that produce very robust T&E enrollment data. There's really only three: Australia, Germany, and the UK. And I've plotted how their enrollments, T&E enrollments, have grown over the past decade. And you can see that, I suppose, a few things from this chart. One, you can see how large a market it is for the UK. I mean, almost 500,000 students enrolled offshore on T&E programs, and that's doubled and almost doubled in the past 10 years. And for Australia and Germany too, it's been quite a steady growth trajectory. I think, the US would be quite an active country as well, but just doesn't collect or produce any data. Another way to track it is through just the numbers of programs that are approved by host countries, and that's the way that host countries tend to measure T&E. It's not through enrollments; it's through the numbers of programs that they've approved, and that also, tells a story of pretty fast growth over the past decade or so. In fact, faster than the rate at which international student mobility has grown. I think we've seen as well an increased impetus since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, and certainly you can see the last year there. The 2021 academic year for the UK, there was a really strong surge in recruitment onto T&E programs, which is kind of interesting because it shows the potential for overlap between student recruitment and T&E, and it shows that T&E can be considered as a viable alternative under certain conditions. I thought you might be interested as well to see who the UK's main T&E partner countries are. And many of these would be the same for Australia as well. So it probably represents, I think it's reasonable to assume that these are the main T&E host markets in the world, or at least most of them. For a long time, Malaysia was the UK's main market, but China has overtaken that in the last couple of years. There's been pretty phenomenal growth there. And in fact, Malaysia and Singapore are markets that have declined for the UK over the last 5 years, quite considerably. These are markets that seem to have been kind of matured, I guess. There isn't the same demand for T&E. The local institutions that partnered with the UK universities, in many cases, no longer need to do so. They've learned what they need to learn. They've become proficient themselves. And in a sense, it's an example of how T&E has been successful in building up some of these education systems. I think going in the opposite trajectory, you've got countries like Sri Lanka and Egypt that are very much in growth mode. So, kind of concentrated in East Asia and Middle East and North Africa, definitely, as things currently stand. One point I'd like to make is most of these countries have really good regulatory systems in place. And it's always something we watch out for, is when the policies start to get pretty well developed, because that's when T&E becomes properly managed and regulated and quality assured, and it's of a higher standard, and it becomes more sustainable. And I think probably one country that would stand out there is Sri Lanka, where there aren't really many regulatory system, isn't much of a regulatory architecture in place, and therefore I'd question as to how sustainable that growth is. But generally, these are countries with a pretty solid regulations in place. I'd say looking forward, the potential we would see there being a bit of a tectonic shift, I would say, towards South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Should these countries get the regulations in place, there's all of our kind of market analysis, which suggests that there's a lot of prospective kind of pent up demand there that could well be realized if the regulations are developed. And just my second last slide is because China is the largest host country in the world for T&E, I just wanted to throw up some of the data there. This chart shows who China's main T&E partner countries are. You can see in terms of numbers of programs, the joint programs, that the US is its leading partner, followed by the UK and Australia. I should say, if you were to look at this by student numbers, the UK would be considerably larger than the US, because a lot of the US institutes are relatively niche, whereas the UK ones, like the likes of University in Liverpool, Jiaotong, has got about 20,000 students. So the UK probably has a larger footprint in terms of student numbers. But I think what's interesting here is that Canada is one of China's most active TNE partners. It's sixth largest number of joint programs, 63 joint programs, 3 joint institutes. And British Columbia is kind of leading the charge there in China with 18 joint programs. And I've listed the individual institutions there that are involved. I just wanted to make the point that, yes, I would say Canada probably is not extremely active in TNE. I think this probably is its most active market. And from the work I do, I don't see Canadian universities popping up all that much in the different countries I cover. But in China, definitely there is a significant presence there. And I think that's something that obviously a lot of work has gone into developing these partnerships. So just to end my segment and just to maybe provide some kind of food for thought, I would say, yeah, I think Canada is probably a bit behind the curve on TNE, considering how successful you've been at recruiting international students and considering the status, prestige of your higher education institutions. But that's not to say that there aren't lots of opportunities to be realized out there. And as I say, I think, there's a number of countries in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa that are really starting to get serious about TNE, and they're starting to put the regulations in place. And I think India is a big one to watch in that regard. Of course, these countries come with their own challenges, and affordability and so on is an issue. But probably a good time to be thinking about TNE. I would also say that the pandemic has spurred increased interest in TNE. A lot of countries are now, host countries are starting to get, as I say, quite serious now about developing their regulations. I think there's a lot of precedent for them to learn from as well. I see countries like Morocco starting to say, we need to develop our policies, and actually look what Egypt's done. We can learn a lot from what Egypt's done. So there's more of that happening. So that's good to see. I'll just make a couple of points though. I think from an institutional perspective, you really need to be very clear about why you would be getting involved in TNE. Is it about recruiting more international students? And if so, what are your realistic expectations for that? And what happens if the regulations change in the host country, which means that TNE no longer access the platform that it once did, such as has happened in China? If it's about accessing research, research funding, how realistic is that? You need time to make them work. There's a huge attrition rate with TNE programs. About a quarter of all the programs approved in China never actually commence, and then there's about another big proportion that commence and don't last very long. So it takes a lot of work. It's like developing any kind of partnership. The due diligence, the time needs to be put in. So it's not necessarily for the faint-hearted, and it doesn't. I wouldn't go into these things with your eyes closed. And I'm always kind of really surprised when I hear from a university that says we're going to open a campus in Dubai and we're going to have 5,000 students in 5 years from now, and I kind of think, well, probably not. But so yeah, and I think another point to make is that host countries are becoming quite savvy about what they want to achieve from TNE. What they want is the genuinely academic collaborations, and they want more reciprocity, including with regard to student mobility, not just being feeder countries sending students out. They want students coming in as well. So I think we're going to see, more interest in the collaborative forms of TNE as we move forward, and that's kind of the direction of travel. So really, that's just my few slides to get the ball rolling today. And I'd like to hand over next to Diane Simpson, who's principal at the Humber International Graduate School at Humber College. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, John. That was really, there we go. Just getting my screen share up here. That was very, very informative, and I think really helps to set the stage for our discussion today, and really looking at what is happening in in Canada, and why we are behind the curve. And certainly it's not the first time we've been behind the curve. We could certainly argue that in terms of international recruitment, the mobility, bringing students to Canada, Canada was behind the scene, behind the curve a little bit in that regard as well. Sorry, I'm just 1 minute here. I just want to, there we go, find my screen here. So today in terms of my presentation, and I don't want to talk too long because I know the discussion is really, really important, but I'm going to talk a little bit about why we are where we are in terms of Canada, and our, really core focus at the moment in terms of bringing students to Canada. As John highlighted, we are active in terms of institutional activity in TNE. He cited examples in China, and I just want to talk a little bit about that in terms of the types of the types of TNE that we are engaged with, and then talk about the Canadian, moving forward towards the Canadian model. And that's when I'll turn it over to Kevin, and he'll talk a little bit more about what that could look like or might look like. So a little bit about international education in Canada. And Canada has long been engaged in international education, and this is aligned, as with many countries, with aligned closely with our foreign policy. And in the 50s and 60s, our international education initiatives across institutions was really focused on overseas development and assistance in international cooperation, and funding scholars to come to Canada to study, often to return home to build capacity locally in their own countries. There was a shift then, and I should also mention at that time, Canada as a nation was really focused on soft power in terms of foreign policy, and we were really committed to supporting a just and equitable world. With the 1970s and 80s and a shift in terms of the global economy, funding, there were a lot of significant funding cuts in terms of our ODA funding here in Canada. And of course, that flowed through to the institutions as well. And it was during that time that the narrative around international education and projects and scholars started to shift. And there was new policy directions and policy papers that really started to talk about international students as visitors to Canada, and to advocate for a differentiated fee structure, with the view of highlighting sort of the socioeconomic benefits of bringing international students in. And that conversation started as early as sort of the late 70s and into the 80s. And as we moved to the 1990s, really solidified that narrative in terms of the country to move to differentiated fees. And though many institutions were now starting to prioritize internationalization as an institutional strategy and priority, they were also looking at it in terms of the fiscal relevancy of increasing international enrollment to offset declining funding. It was during the 1990s that institutions did begin to explore and implement offshore delivery of credentials, largely through pathway programs, really looking at bringing international students to Canada. So not dissimilar to what John was talking about in terms of rationales. The many institutions, and I think this is where some of the China partnerships started to develop, was in the mid to late 90s, early 2000s, as potential pathways. So to Canada. There were a few schools at that time that ventured into offshore branch campuses, but really across Canada, this has really been viewed, I would say, and I think others would agree, with a lot of trepidation. These initiatives are seen as high risk and requiring a significant amount of resources. So it's not it's not as easy as a route, shall we say, as recruiting international students. Um, by the early 2000s, it was evident that Canada was really behind the other big markets and even comparable markets like Australia and New Zealand in terms of international recruitment. And there, at that time, there was a lot of advocacy to the government to change immigration regulations to favor international students as sort of pathways. As immigration pathways to Canada. And during the 2000s, a number of immigration policies were implemented to really promote Canada as a destination for international students. This had a significant increase in terms of our attractiveness and really that view of Canada as a destination. And we in 2012, the federal government really recognized the importance from an economic perspective, from a socioeconomic perspective of international education. And they moved to develop our first international education strategy, which was launched in 2014. And I'll come back to that policy shortly. You can see from this graph here the sort of growth in terms of international students. And I don't want to spend too much time here, but I just do want to talk about the impact, the significant impact that those policy changes had on in terms of flows to international students to the country. Now, there were other things happening globally as well that helped to attract students to Canada as a destination, but we moved to number 3 globally, or sorry, in terms of Western receiving countries, and 4th globally behind so US, UK, China, and then Canada. We grew 7% in just 5 years from 2015 to 2020 in terms of the percentage of international students studying in post-secondary institutions in Canada. And a lot of that growth, especially from 2017 to now, has really has been focused in the college sector, where in many colleges in Ontario, for example, international students account for 30 to 50 or 60% of the total population. So there's a question around sustainability in terms of this model. There's, there are a lot of risks associated with a heavy reliance in terms of immigration pathways and flows of students. We see other markets really emerging in terms of more affordable and closer to home options for international students. So just something to sort of think about as we move forward. As I mentioned earlier, Canada has been, and John highlighted, engaged in some T&E activity. The problem and the issue that we really run into is tracking this is data. We don't have any at both provincial and federal levels. We don't have any way of really collecting how many students we have studying abroad, or how many students we have studying in Canadian credentials outside of Canada, how many joint and double degrees there are. We know that from some of our surveying by our associations, so University Canada members reported in 2018 that 72% had one or more pathway programs. So these would be 2+2s or 2+1s that are looking at bringing students from partner countries to Canada. And in 2014, 78% of member University Canada member institutions cited joint or double degree programs. But again, we don't know how many students are enrolled in those. And this is sort of only one segment of our post-secondary market as well. And of course, there is a lot of activity in terms of research and faculty going abroad as well. On the independent, in terms when we look at independent modes of TNE, we know that many of our institutions are delivering distance education, but we don't know how many students, how many of those students are studying from abroad and outside of the pandemic, which has been obviously has created a very different environment where many students are studying remotely, but that is not that is not a long term. And then in terms of branch campuses, as I mentioned and as John mentioned, there's a lot of risk seen with this and a significant amount of resource investment. And according to CBERT, Canada only has 6 registered branch campuses currently, and they have been, some of them have been going for quite some time. But we run into problems here in the country in terms of categorizing and ensuring that we're all talking about the same things when we talk about TNE. And I think that's something that we may struggle with for a while. And part of that is comes back to that our national strategy. As I mentioned, in 2014, we launched our first international education strategy with a strong focus on recruitment of international students. That strategy was developed through the Ministry of International Trade. And there was also, a key focus in getting Canadians to study abroad, which is a whole other area for discussion. In 2019, under the Liberal government, 3 ministries collaborated to put forth a more coordinated international education strategy. Now, this was just before the pandemic, so we haven't really had an opportunity to see what this means. But in it, they became more, the new revised international education strategy promised to focus more on, streamlined objectives to 3, with a focus on the third objective being a focus on growing export services and exploring new opportunities for institutions abroad, with an investment in terms of trade commission offices abroad. So there is an opportunity. The pandemic has changed the world, as we all know, and we don't know what kind of opportunities lie ahead of us. But I think we do have an opportunity to really look at what a Canadian TNE model could look like. But it would take a coordinated approach at a national level, which, as you all know, can be very challenging. I think, as institutions, many of us are very committed to the Sustainable Development Goals, and what that means globally as we move forward. We know that attracting the best and the brightest has implications in terms of the countries from which our students are coming from. So how might we leverage TNE for a more holistic, a more systematic and coordinated approach to international education that is not solely focused on benefits to Canadians in Canada, but takes a more fulsome approach and holistic approach. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Kevin Hall, who will talk about the Canadian, the possibilities for Canada in this regard. So over to you, Dr. Hall. Thank you.
Thanks, Diane. It's a great summary of where we're sitting in Canada at this point in time. And I guess I was just going to start off really talking about the SDGs and SDG 4, which is quality education. And I think this is a commitment on a global scale to make sure people have access to good quality education. And I think that has to be the starting point for universities in particular for their globally engaged education platform. For me, TNE is a part of the life cycle of education that I'll talk about in a little while, but it's got some tremendous opportunities for us, I think, because Canada hasn't been engaged in TNE a lot. I like, as an engineer and an entrepreneur, being disruptive and being innovative, and I think that gives us a, if you like, a license to really redefine what TNE could be for Canadian institutions. I think there's a number of things right off the bat that are attractive to me for TNE. First of all, it is about attracting high quality students. And not all high quality students have access to a lot of money. So what are we doing as institutions around SDG4, around quality education? So how are we addressing the issue of access to education for all of those smart people around the world that need education delivered perhaps in situ where they're sitting? It also, TNE allows us to ensure really a global focus in everything we do, and that's whether it's teaching, it's the research and research partnerships, it's our alumni engagement, government relations, industry partnerships. We really need to be having a global focus these days because the world is so interconnected. And so TNE is a catalyst for a global focus for us, if you like, and it's something that can help us build reputation and ranking, but it can help us also with our commitments to the Sustainable Development Goals. TNE is great for knowledge exchange and mobility opportunities, both inbound and outbound. And I think at the end of the day, it's really a good way to really improve the experience of international students, both on our campuses here in Canada, but also at our offshore activities. And for me, TNE is a great a way of looking at a question we often ask ourselves as institutions: who do we want to partner with? Why should we? Where do we want to partner? And what types of programs? And when is it right to do that? So TNE we can use as that basis. I talked about the cycle of education, and I think this is one of the areas that universities here in Canada have not participated well, and I would like to think universities are engaged in the whole cycle of education, the pre-university stage, the K-12 sector, while students are at university, and then of course post-university, what happens after your degree, and so how can universities be involved with their alumni, with their communities, and lifelong learning. And I'm going to talk about each of these three areas and talk about where I think there's opportunities for universities in Canada to get engaged. And a lot of that's based on some of the experience I gained while working at the University of Newcastle in Australia, where we tried to attack all of these basic pieces of education. I'll start with the K-12, and I'll just really say there's a couple of things for me that really strike home. There's a number of services out there that are AI-based, artificial intelligence-based, counseling systems that work with guidance counselors, particularly at IB schools. One of them, for example, is called BridgeU, that has about 80,000 students registered that put in 900,000 applications last year for university programs. There's about 2,800 universities registered in the BridgeU program, and this allows students to kind of look at what their interests are, how they're doing it at school, and where it might be suitable to go and get a degree from an institution that kind of aligns with yourself. The other piece I think is really important is looking at universities getting engaged in high schools, IB high schools, either on campus or offshore. At Newcastle, we had 1,000 IB students from 25 countries, which are really a feeder into the University of Newcastle. And one of the great things about this is getting students prepped for a university career. They become associated, or they feel like they're part of a university while they're going through high school. And this translates into a lot of movement from the high school system into universities. It's almost 100% conversion rate, which is getting more and more kids interested in universities. The universities themselves, I think, it all starts with networks. And as universities, we need to build these global networks. We need to build them around our strengths as universities. We need to connect with universities that share the same ethos and ethics that we do. And these networks will give opportunities, quite frankly, for our faculty, our staff, and our students. And staff are often forgotten in the mix of universities. We talk a lot about our academic faculty and our students. At Newcastle, we used to send 20 staff members a year to work at international universities that we had chosen to be in our networks, so they would gain some experience on how to do their job a little differently. So the networks themselves, they can be built around a theme like the Sustainable Development Goals, around a research strength like immunology or business, whatever it is. It gives us great opportunities for mobility, both inbound and outbound. And we've also heard from John and Diane about joint programs. I like to think universities typically ignore research programs. And so I know at the University of Newcastle, we developed about 50 joint and dual degrees at the PhD level, which becomes very attractive for students because they get to go to an international lab for part of their degree, perhaps work in a facility that they don't have access to the same types of equipment. And so networks allow us to build those joint degrees as part of TNE. I think offshore campuses, we've talked about. My experience was running a campus in Singapore for the University of Newcastle with about 2,000 students. That was a partnership model. I believe what it does is it offers the high quality education that the Western universities could provide at a lower price point to students that may not want to move as far away from their home as all the way to Canada, for example. And or it's a cheaper price than it would be coming to Canada with all the associated living costs. And I think universities in Canada have not really dabbled that much in the partnership type of delivery that I think is really important. We've also been involved in licensed programs, and these are programs that, again, typically aren't going to make money. As John said at the start, there's not a lot of profit in some of this. There is potentially in an offshore campus, but for the licensed programs, again, it's taking a good program in a specific area, engineering, computer science, medicine, and delivering your program with the partner in the host country, and doing it with their staff, with quality control done by your own staff. But this, again, allows the delivery of a really high quality education to a market that is not looking for an overseas experience, but it's a market that's looking for a really good quality education. The other thing is, we talk about online now and the opportunities that will come because of our pandemic and our switch to online. And I would much prefer to use the word tech-enabled. I think online is a piece of tech-enabled education, but there's no doubt about it as technology improves. We have the ability to deliver our education on any device in any location for any student. And I think we really need to look as a sector at that tech-enabled education and its role in making sure we meet Sustainable Development Goal number 4. The last one I'll do with the universities is really this explosion of the word micro-credentials, which has probably been around in different forms of words for the last 30 years. But how can we work within our networks, within our groups of institutions we want to partner with, and actually share micro-credentials to build degree programs? And yes, there's issues around Senate approvals, government approvals, quality control, but nothing is insurmountable if we put our minds to it and do a little bit of work. The last piece is, I'll just end off with the post-university piece. And I think as institutions, we really owe it to our alumni and to the communities that we sit in to make sure we give them access to continuing lifelong learning. And that, again, means that we want to use our networks and our partners to deliver high quality education to our alumni and our community. We shouldn't be so precious and proud to think we're the only ones capable of delivering that education. And so who do we partner with that can really build a platform for lifelong learning? In this province, in BC, in Australia 5 years ago, the words reskilling, upskilling were very prevalent around the workforce. And so we can utilize the TNE approach also to reskilling and upskilling. And anyone that is familiar with Singapore will know the government there has now committed about $200 billion to environmental restoration, environmental and governance in the businesses. And so that's going to mean a lot of skills training is required in the actual workforce. So reskilling, upskilling. In the network piece, I think if we do form networks, for example, I'm going to use one that we've just joined at University of Victoria, which is the United Nations Institute for Training and Research. They run a program called CFAL. It's the Center for the International Center for the Formation of Authority and Leaders. Its mandate is to get out there and really build knowledge around the Sustainable Development Goals. How can you live your life on a daily basis around the SDGs? How can you run your business in accordance to the principles of the SDGs? How can you run a local government in accordance with the SDGs? And I think through the delivery of either credit or not for credit micro-credentials around things like the SDGs, we're really going to try to drive this planet in a better direction that really creates an equal platform for all the citizens across this planet. So I'm going to finish there just to, again, try to look at TNE as an opportunity really to get involved with the Sustainable Development Goals, in particular to commit to SDG 4, which is quality education for all. So thanks, and I'll turn that over to Randall now, who's going to curate the Q&A.
Great. Thanks, Kevin, Diane, John, much appreciated. I'd ask all of you to put your cameras back on and unmute, and we'll jump into a Q&A period and discussion here. We've got one question which John has answered already, and I would encourage other participants to please submit some questions. But in reference to a couple of things that were said, tying it into David McGuire's question here, John, you mentioned a huge number of UK TNE students studying offshore. I can't remember what it was, 500,000 or a huge number. But my understanding was in any number of recent years, the number of students enrolled in UK institutions, international students, is higher outside of the UK than actually in the UK. And then Kevin, your reference to a couple of these things, the tech-enabled learning, the COIL, micro-credentials, I think all of these sort of feed back into David's question here about institutions' residency requirements. And I'm just wondering if, as we further embrace TNE, tech-enabled learning, micro-credentials, is this fundamentally calling into question the idea of residency, the idea of bricks and mortar, or are these all, can these all be married and be compatible?
Maybe just on the first point there on the UK's offshore provision. I mean, it depends on how you count it. For quite a while, the UK counted professional programs as being part of TNE, but more recently they've decided that it should only be counting higher education programs specifically. So it's not counting the accountancy type qualifications and the marketing type qualifications, for example, the ACCA and all that's delivered outside of the UK. They stopped including that. And since they did that, that's brought the TNE numbers down. So they're now below the numbers of students recruited into the UK. But there's not a huge difference. So you're right. It is a large number. But just to make that point, I think the point I was making was that, you know, TNE, a lot of students, international students in the UK, have come to the UK via some kind of a TNE partnership or TNE pathway. And this is especially pronounced historically in China and Malaysia, where I think, you know, over half of the students that came from Malaysia at one point in time came to the UK through a TNE partnership. That has declined. That propensity for TNE to act as a pathway to the UK has declined in several of the bigger markets, mainly down to regulatory changes. So, for example, in China now, they require more and more of the TNE study to take place in China. They no longer approve 2+2. They'll approve some 2+1, but what their preference is for all of that undergraduate study now to take place in China. So those kind of regulatory changes can have a big impact.
Rand, I mean, I'd like to address the residency requirement. I mean, I think this is an artifact of a 600-year-old education system. You know, residency requirement, credit mapping is one of the things that just absolutely drives me nuts, how we always think a particular course. I'm an engineer. Fluid mechanics at my university is better than fluid mechanics at Oxford. I mean, you know, we have to learn to become a little more adaptable. We see this going on with things like Coursera. You know, I was able to take a fantastic course in epidemiology from Karolinska University in Sweden, a number, 5 medical school in the world. I can take a business course from UBC through Coursera for $199, and I can take a master class in guitar playing from Jimmy Page if I want to for a couple $1,000. And I'm just, you know, we need to get more modern with our systems. I'm not sure why residency requirements should really come into play when we're starting to look at delivering a high quality education on a global platform. I think the key is the content, and the quality of the courses has to be maintained, of course, but I'm not sure why the residency requirement would be there, other than it's an artifact.
Great, thank you. We have one question Elizabeth Lee's put into the chat box here. Is there any chance for small colleges with no degree programs, for example, to collaborate with some universities to develop joint programs?
Yeah, I mean, it usually works the other way around. Actually, it's usually that the sending country is the institution that has the degree awarding power, and the partner in the host country is doesn't have. I've not seen it really work the other way around. I think that might be quite difficult. There might be some opportunities in terms of you know uh, some kind of research collaboration, or some kind of uh, fact staff exchange, but I haven't seen very much of that example happening.
Um, w- one sort of overarching question in terms of next steps for us here in Canada is we've got a patchwork of provincial and territorial regulations. I think there's 23 ministries of education in Canada. We've got a national strategy, but really no body to help deliver that. I'm just wondering. I know, John, you've referenced the German model, where the German government is actually engaged with opening up a branch campus. But in terms of the Canadian context, do we see, despite some narrative in the new strategy, is there any likelihood of a coordinated federal engagement here, or do you think this is really going to have to be done either at the provincial or at the institutional level in Canada?
Well, it seems to me, I mean, the model in Germany is very top down. I mean, it's almost all of the activity. Those joint institutes, they're big undertakings, and they take years to develop, and it's all mandated centrally. And I don't really necessarily see it playing out like that in Canada's case. And I think, as you mentioned, the kind of fragmented, the fact that education is managed at the states would kind of militate against that. I think it's more likely that the institutions themselves will probably lead the charge. But that said, I mean, even though in the UK it's the institutions that lead the charge at national level, there's a lot of work goes into removing barriers, let's just say, to T&E, and these would be barriers around recognition of the qualifications, or just raising awareness, helping in some cases the host country to develop their policies and regulations and so on. So a lot of work, a lot of advocacy work happens without it necessarily being top down either. So I think that's where Canada could really benefit from some kind of a coordinated effort in that regard to develop the kind of recognition systems and that kind of an approach.
Yeah, right. If I could build on that, I mean, I just think the provincial jurisdiction over education is kind of a secret. You just absolutely have to keep this, and this really does negate any efforts, I think, that go in on a federal platform, because it doesn't create that coordinated approach we need as a country. We can't even do joint degrees across provinces. They're so hard to set up because of the jurisdictions. And so how are we going to actually do this on a federal basis on a global platform? So I do think it's really up to each province to, I guess, agree to an approach that universities might take with T&E. And in BC, we're actually taking an approach where six universities in BC are going to look at exploring some options together on a global scale, which I think is a fantastic thing. But it is 6 BC universities. And so, the federal government might put a little bit of money in, they might put a little bit of mobility money in, but there's not a lot of control, I guess, if you like, over an education sector that is really spread up, as you say. 23 separate ministries of education really creates an issue. This is one of the big differences I see coming back to Canada after my last 8 years in Australia, is there isn't a push on a federal level to make this a great opportunity for Canada and for the receptors.
Yeah. Alas. Thank you very much. I'm being nudged to say that we are at time. Any last words of wisdom for us moving forward in Canada? Diane, what should we do tomorrow?
Well, I think to what both Kevin and John were speaking about, we do really need to look at regulations at the provincial level, and how we are recognizing credit and credit mobility. That number one, I think that is an ongoing problem across the country in terms of credit mobility and our flexibility, our need to be more flexible. And I speak about that coming from a college, and how challenging it can be for our students sometimes to pathway to universities in the province. So globally, you can just imagine how challenging that is. So I think we do need to look at modernizing our jurisdictions across Canada, and then really coming together to take a more coordinated approach that also looks at what we're doing in terms of development, in terms of through GAC programming. We are engaged. I know Humber's engaged in development projects that are looking at building and enhancing technical vocational systems in Kenya and other countries. So how can we all be working together and with a more coordinated approach, I think is really critical.
Great, thank you. Kevin?
Look, I think we just need to be brave, courageous, and you know, as I opened up around the SDGs aren't just about Canada. The quality education for all across this planet is something we need to keep in the backs of our minds, and that should help drive us on with why we should be playing in the TNE arena and not just focusing on bringing students here to our campuses.
Perfect, thank you. And we'll leave the last word to Dublin.
Thanks very much. I suppose I would just maybe circle back to a point that Kevin made earlier on, that, you know, only about 2% of students around the world have the privilege of having an international student mobility experience. And it largely comes down to cost. You know, most students just simply cannot afford to study abroad overseas for any kind of a period of time. And therefore, you know, what happens for the other 98%? And I think TNE is a mechanism to reach those students and to give them that kind of an opportunity to have an international study experience, albeit within their own country. And I just think that, you know, Canada's got too much to offer. The universities are just too good and have too much, as I said, to offer to not be involved in TNE. So I think definitely, I'm all for it. I think Canadian universities need to get out there. Absolutely.
Great. Thank you all very much. I think this is the beginning of a conversation here in Canada, and certainly here in British Columbia. John, appreciate you coming in from across the ocean there. Much appreciated. We will follow up. This has been recorded, so it will be available for archived on our website. And we look forward to our next conversation on this. Thank you for joining us. Much appreciated.
Everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.